Robert Kennedy, a Democratic hopeful, was running for president. He was murdered in June of 1968. Protests got ugly at the Democratic National Convention that year, mostly aimed against Vice President Hubert Humphrey, who had plans of continuing the war in Vietnam, much like Johnson was. The Chicago police wildly attacked demonstrators. It was just a tough year at home and abroad. Television brought the Vietnam War home and really opened Americans' eyes to the horrors of this war. So 1968, Richard Nixon's comeback. Lost the election for president in 1960. Didn't even win the California governor race in 1962. People thought Nixon was just done with politics. But he came back campaigning as a champion of the silent majority, of those ordinary Americans, and he called for a return to law and order. So Nixon defeats Hubert Humphrey, and Nixon's going to continue the liberal policies of the Great Society, much like Eisenhower continued those liberal policies from FDR and from Truman. Nixon's election will initiate a new period of conservatism, which will really dominate the period, because the late 60s, early 70s, again in the 80s with Ronald Reagan, and then George Bush in late 80s, early 90s, and then George W. Bush in the 2000s. But there was a lasting legacy of the 1960s. New rights and understandings of freedom emerged. Rights for racial minorities were finally achieved. But not all the problems were solved, of course. Poverty continued. Problems within the urban ghettos continue to this day. Here's an image of the election of 1968 showing Nixon's return and victory. And here's a painting called Signs from 1970. You see Man on the Moon, which was accomplished in 1969. Robert Kennedy here, his brother John, Martin Luther King, Vietnam. All right, that concludes our 1960s PowerPoint and presentation.